Some of the stuff that I'm going to sort of touch on is similar to some of the things that other people have spoken about, but I'm going to use a slightly different model. And it was a model developed by an economist, realizing that biodiversity and the environment cannot be functional, the economics and the social and the environment is so intertwined that the two have to be spoken and looked at critically together. And they refer to it as the donut model. And it actually since it was sort of developed by Oxfam, it quite grew in the applicability of other people that wanted to link social and sociological and human well-being aspects. So I'm just firstly going to touch on the model and how it filtered actually, and South Africa has also used this model when they looked at their environmental resilience and environmental boundaries that's been crossed already. And then I will look at two species, sort of just testing if you can actually use this model when you look at a species specifically, to see if this is a useful way to argue for a species when you try to conserve it or not. And then basically leave you with questions and things to think about, because it actually relates to such a complex topic and the things that you've got to think about, especially when you're in government with us, because everything is, you fight for the same piece of cake at the end of the day. So looking at the model itself, so what they did is that they said, well, the Earth's got its boundaries, and when you cross those boundaries, you either cannot bring it back, or it will be very difficult to bring it back. And then within the social realm, human well-being is then also defined of what people perceive as a safe space to live in and an acceptable space where they feel they've been heard, or they can participate in decisions of that country and things like that. But in essence, what the model is about, although it links to certain aspects of social and environmental groupings, if you can call it that, it's actually to create a platform to stimulate debate. So the model is not the answer, and it's not to guide you in something that you go and implement, but it's to stimulate the debate so that the economics person, the social person, and the environmental person can reach a common ground when they discuss topics. So basically, globally, human populations most probably is the most competing species on Earth. So depending on whose statistics you read, they vary, but in essence, the environmental boundaries has been already crossed in terms of climate change. That's a big topic these days. The nitrogen and phosphorus loading cycles, and land conversions, so there's land degradation and things like that, and then biodiversity loss. So some people view that humans have caused 83% of all the species that's been lost on Earth, and that 50% of the plant species has been lost due to human impacts. So, and what they also say is that although human consumption might be an essential part of the Earth and the functions that we've got to acknowledge as conservationists, the challenge is that when you look at avifauna, for example, 70% of the biomass is actually for food, not your biodiversity, not that sustains your resilience in your environmental systems. So then South Africa did the same exercise. And for South Africa, we've already crossed our freshwater border, benchmark, whatever you want to call it. Our marine harvesting is unsustainable already. Obviously, climate change is global, and South Africa has felt that that's also an issue for them. And then with regards to arable land, phosphorus loading, and air pollution, we're already within 10% of crossing that benchmark as well. When you look at the human well-being aspects, our unemployment, crime, things like that is enormous in South Africa. And there's an enormous extent of inequality as well. So you've got 32% of the country's income that resides with 4% of the people in the country. So, well, what the Northern Cape looks like when you sort of try to contextualize it in the models. For the Northern Cape specifically, we're basically a third of the country's surface. But that doesn't mean we get the third of the budgets. Because our population is only 2% of the country, we get 2.7% of the national budget. Because budget is primarily allocated in relation to social needs. Then, when you look at the biodiversity, again, it varies between stats, but more or less 21% of South Africa's biodiversity is perceived to be in the Northern Cape, which is a third of the country. But when you go to the provincial budget, we only get 0.9% of the provincial budget for biodiversity conservation. Bringing that back to context, when you look at the humans within the social context and GDP with the province, in essence, what this slide just basically says is that already in 2011, we've exceeded our water use quota. We're basically now depleting the water in the Northern Cape since 2011. Then, when you look at the extent of the probability of this area regenerating, grazing, and things like that, we're the least productive because we're the most arid. However, 93% of the population, basically, land surface use-wise, is directly dependent on that environment, which is either for grazing or for wildlife management. So when you sort of put that in context, one would think, well, then 93% of your effort should go into conservation and protection, which is actually not the case. What I just want to illustrate from this slide is that annually our effective budget is decreasing by 0.5%, and in essence, it is basically the contribution that we give to the provincial GDP revenue is more than what we receive from the provincial budget. And the consequence of that for conservation and looking at species conservation basically means that you've got an increase in what they call specialist inputs. So you've got to comment on EIAs and permit applications, but you never get the budget to actually go and see on the ground what's going on, which means it's a risk of environmental sustainability. When you look at external funding, because that's what we turn to, you've got to get other people to fund whatever you're doing. There was an increase in the funding, but the funding wasn't for the projects. It's for getting you to do the ad hoc stuff, the stuff that just you respond to something, but you don't get the baseline information to make a proper recommendation. So when you start looking at species, so we've got these two species that's supposed to be charismatic, it's icons, it's used in our branding, it's used in marketing, there's routes named after these two species, but there's no budget coming for these species. And as I mentioned, the quite interesting one is that research was triggered, though slightly, it appears to be, for allodichotoma, which is quite interesting. But when you start now saying, well, we want to trade from the wild, we want to use things from the wild, but you don't know what the quotas are. When you look at allodichotoma, the former name of it, we had a situation where the trade from the wild was quite extensive at some point. And because we didn't know anything about the population dynamics, we had to put a moratorium in place. In contrast to that, with Allopilansi, which is an endangered species, we did some quite extensive analysis, and in essence, basically, that species only regenerates itself between 50 to 70 years. So one would expect that if you impact and collect from the wild more than 1% or 2%, which is our policies at this point, you are going to destroy the species' long-term survival potential. So looking at trade and things like that, it is a risk, and trying to calculate quotas is economically just not feasible for people to say this is a sustainable way in which you can use the species and trade with the species. So then one would say, well, okay, so why not invest in conserving an ecosystem where that species occur? Because in our latest and outlook reports and state of environment reports, habitat destruction is basically regarded as one of the primary drivers of species loss. So you can argue that and say, well, protect the habitat, and you, as a consequence, protect the species. The challenge would be this tug-of-war for land use. So Allopenansi only occurs in the Richtersveld in southern parts of Namibia, and they are within what they call a World Heritage Area, and they are within a protected area. However, those Transfrontier Park, the Richtersveld II, is not fenced. Community grazing is allowed in the area, and there is mining in that protected area. So you will ask yourself, well, how well protected is that species? Going on to Allodichotoma, you've got a similar situation. And coincidentally, when you look at the map on your right-hand side, the range where we have looked at the species is coinciding with where primarily corridors for grid, gas, and solar developments are focused on. Again, you ask, protecting the habitat, is it really worth it for the species? So then, sort of looking into the model itself, and you want to try and use this model to argue for the species, I would say it's not really the best model to use, although there are aspects that's valuable that you can pull out of it. But I think what is more important is the way in which we communicate it, rather than actually just using the model itself. And it's trying to communicate, to develop that sense of ownership of species, the sense of want to conserve it, and trying to manage that as well, because the challenge of land availability is just going to increase in the future. Just to conclude some of the remarks, it's a bit of a philosophical debate as well. If any of you have been involved in situations where you've got to argue, why do you need to protect this butterfly? Well, it's endangered. It doesn't bring me food. And that's why it's a bit ethical and philosophical, and it's emotional debate. Then, obviously, it's the economic side of it. The bioeconomy. Everybody feels that you've got to market the species, give it economic value, and then it will assist in securing the species' future. There's pros and cons to both of that, but it's a huge debate. The tendency that one seems to sort of pick up at this moment is that it's short-term gains, but long-term loss, sort of the path that we're on at this point, it seems. So how do you balance those? Because I need food now, but I know the resilience needs to keep the future intact. And then obviously the legal debate that everyone else has been spoken about. Not a very good picture, but I hope it makes some sense in getting the debates going further.
Thank you very much.